Hello again, your friend and neighborhood host JT Wheatley back for another episode of the History of Comic Books podcast. This time we'll be delving into the history of King Features Syndicate, the king of comic strips. There would be no comic books without comic strips, since the very first ones were just a collection of the many classic strips in comic book form, similar to how modern-day trades collect comic books. Of the many companies that made strips, King Features was one of the most significant, not only producing numerous classic strips, but pushing the medium in important directions, notably with the invention of the comic superhero with Mandrake the Magician and the Phantom, while also producing other classic characters like Popeye and Beetle Bailey. Often such stories started with humble beginnings, but not King Features, as its founder was no less than the legendary media tycoon, William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863 in San Francisco, California, the son of millionaire miner George Hearst and his much younger wife, Phoebe Appleton. As a boy, Hearst took many tours in Europe in the 1870s, where he discovered William Bosch's Max and Moritz about gleeful pranksters in the comics. Later, when Hearst attended Harvard, he worked on its legendary Harvard Lampoon paper until he was expelled for pulling too many pranks. He began his newspaper career in 1887 when he transformed the San Francisco Examiner into a premier paper, which his father, George Hearst, had won in 1880 as a payment for a gambling debt. It was here that Hearst started his method for business, buying the best equipment and hiring the best talent for his newspaper, which included writers like Mark Twain and Jack London, along with political cartoonist Homer Davenport. Dreaming of starting a newspaper empire, Hearst used his fortune his father earned from his mining enterprises after his death in 1891 to start his media one. On October 10, 1895, Hearst purchased the New York Journal to compete with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, dropping the price of each issue to 1 penny and forcing Pulitzer to do the same. To further the competition, Hearst hired away the World's Sunday paper staff, such as Morrow Gorud, the editor of Pulitzer's Sunday World, and Richard F. Alcott, Pulitzer's top cartoonist, who would go on to help create the modern comic strip. William Randolph Hearst realized early that comic strips helped sell newspapers, so he tasked Alcott with creating The American Humorist, an 8-page color comic strip supplement. On October 18, 1896, for Hearst's Sunday Journal, it featured the Yellow Kid as its star attraction, about a tenement-dwelling kid who wore a yellow nightshirt, thus inspiring his name. He previously appeared in Pulitzer's New York World from 1895 to 1898, and would continue to appear since World would claim the copyright. Due to the nature of the Yellow Kid essentially advertising for the New York World and New York Journal, and how they often made up stories to promote their papers, it would also give rise to the term yellow journalism. With this, the New York Journal sold 375,000 copies despite increasing its price from 3 to 5 cents. With the success of comic strips, they were heavily merchandised for extra profit with songs, buttons, magazines, and so forth. Alcott would later create Buster Brown for the New York Herald on May 4, 1902, about a well-to-do boy and his pet pit bull, Tiggy. With this strip, Alcott began to innovate the use of word balloons in multiple panels, and though he wasn't the first to do so, Alcott made it the standard that all strips would follow afterwards, thus setting up what is now considered the modern comic strip. He eventually got lured back by Hearst, where Buster and his dog Tig premiered in the New York American on January 14, 1906. While Alcott would never own his characters outright due to copyright law, he did make what was then a fortune off the merchandising, reportedly $75,000 a year at the time, along with the legacy of setting up the standard for the modern comic strip before his death on September 25, 1928. In 2008, he was posthumously inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. Other papers started to take notice of the success of comic strips, with many starting Sunday cartoon sections as well. This Hearst also found a way to capitalize on, as he had the American Humorist syndicated to sell the papers across the country, leading to national celebrity for many of the artists involved and the characters they created. Hearst himself continued to expand his own newspaper empire, buying the Chicago American in 1900, the Los Angeles Examiner in 1903, and the Boston American in 1904, all of which, of course, had nice comic sections. All the while, the Spanish-American War came along, which greatly expanded the role and popularity of American newspapers, as they essentially promoted the war, with many even blaming us for getting into it, and gave further rise to the term yellow journalism. Hearst continued to expand comic strips to fill his newspapers, such as commissioning the creation of the Katzenjammer Kids by Rudolph Dix on December 12th in 1897 for the American Humorist. becoming another standout feature, along with the first comic strip to feature regular use of word balloons for character speech. Katzenjammer, which means cats yowling in German, was a popular term for a hangover at the time. Featuring the adventures of pranksters Hans and Fritz, and soon their long-suffering mama, the rotund mariner Der Captain in 1902, and his sidekick Der Inspector in 1905. The series was so popular it was made into a series of live-action shorts in 1898 and the cartoons in 1910s and 1930s. Frederick Opper joined in 1899, and he debuted Happy Hooligan on March 11th of 1900 about an Irish hobo with a tin can for a hat, and would run until 1932. Opper used word balloons from the beginning while creating other features for Hearst's Sunday Journal and the American Humorists, such as the R. and the Villain Ancestors, January of 1900, Apollosia and Gaston on November 24th of 1901, and Her Name Was Maud on June of 24th of 1904, and Hoss and Lot on April 25th of 1909. Opper was also a noted political cartoonist, supporting Hearst's campaigns along against trust, while also making an early use of what is now the infamous term, fake news. Bud Fisher, who previously introduced the successful strip Mud and Jeff about two mismatched tin horns, appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on November 15th of 1907 and was signed on with Hearst in 1909. Mud and Jeff is commonly believed to be the first successful daily strip. While the horse racing strip A. Piker Clerk by Clark Briggs holds the official title of first strip to feature a recurring character in multiple panels 6 days a week, it only lasted from 1903 to June 7th of 1904 in the Chicago American, of course, a Hearst paper. Thus, it was Mud and Jeff, which was inspired by A. Piker Clark, latter's success that set the standard for daily black and white strips, as it lasted to 1983, and it would also inspire cartoons, films, and comic books along the way. Of note, when Fisher left for Hearst, he was able to retain the copyright for Mud and Jeff, thus bringing the strip with him, and through his syndicate exposing it to millions more readers. Fisher eventually handed over the strip to Al Smith in 1932, and upon Fisher's death in 1954, Smith was allowed to actually sign his own name, continuing the strip in 1980 when he handed it over to George Brusher, who continued it to his final years. Today, Mud and Jeff remains a permanent part of pop culture, even if many have forgotten the original comic. Mismatched characters and good cop, bad cop routines are still called Mud and Jeff. Jimmy Swinnerton drew the comic Little Bears for the San Francisco Examiner, having joined the paper in 1892 as a staff cartoonist when he was a teenager. He was soon assigned the children's section of comics page, where Little Bears evolved from, and some even debating this was the original comic strip, predating the Yellow Kid by 3 years. While debatable considering that what many consider a comic strip today, Swinnerton was producing multiple panels with word balloons in 1900. In 1896, Swinnerton moved to New York to work on the Journal American, where he produced Mr. Jack about a philandering anthropomorphic tiger till 1904, and then Little Jimmy about a scatterbrained boy, which ran until 1958, and even appeared in a cartoon with Betty Boop. However, Swinnerton was diagnosed with tuberculosis, forcing him to move to Arizona for the dry climate, and paid for by Hearst, as he considered Swinnerton one of his favorite employees. He would recover but stay there, commuting between Arizona and California while working as a landscape painter. But he didn't forget cartoons, as he provided 50 backgrounds for Chuck Jones's Merry Melodies at Warner Brothers, of course the cartoons which were Bugs Bunny and Porky Pig appeared in. Soon, Alcott, Dirks, and Opper were being imitated by cartoonists nationwide, using the same mix of occurring characters, word balloons, sequential panels, and bright colors to attract readers. All this led to the creation of the Sunday Funnies, which would be featured in 75% of U.S. papers in 1908. To serve all these papers, syndicates were formed with Hearst, McClure, and World Color companies serving 3/4 of the market. From 1910 to 1915, daily black and white strips also became a regular feature in newspapers as well. Newspaper Enterprise Association, NEA, was formed to distribute E.W. Scripps' chain of comics in 1902, while Pulitzer launched the Press Publishing Syndicate in 1905, followed by Newspaper Feature Service, NFS, by Hearst in 1913. Founded by Moses Konigsberg, the NFSS would be the first to provide budget features to newspapers for 7 days a week. Plus, comics started to change as well, from more urban fare to family-friendly, going with what newspaper readers were doing. With the growing success of comic strips, cartoonists started to earn huge salaries thanks to the royalties from their strips selling nationwide, usually around 50%. Syndicates received the other half and handled the distribution and financial issues, thus allowing the artist to focus just on the strip itself. This showed that syndicates actually foster the creativity of many of these cartoons and their comic strips, and it allows them to focus on writing the stories while they took all the money in the financial dealings. By November 16, 1915, Moses Koenigsberg consolidated all of Hearst's operations under a single umbrella entity in the King Features Syndicate during the peak of newspapers, with 2,262 separate papers and a circulation of 28 million. The name of the company was inspired by his own name, Conan means king in German, and thus King Features Syndicate was officially born. It didn't transform the industry at first, but now it is under one roof, and it will soon become a force to be reckoned with. On February 2nd, 1915, Harry Hirschfeld created Abby the Agent, which featured the first Jewish protagonist in a comic strip about a car salesman, having previously done Desperate Desmond and Dauntless Durham of the USA. George McManus would introduce Irish immigrants with Bringing Up Father, also known as Jiggs and Maggie, a strip that ran until May 28th of 2000 about Jiggs, an Irish hood carrier turned millionaire, and his short-tempered wife Maggie. The strip became so popular it inspired plays, radio shows, animated shorts, and short films. George Harriman launched the Dingbat family, and then Crazy Cat began on October 28, 1913, originally a filler feature in the Dingbat family, with his Sunday feature starting in 1916. The strip was about a guileless cat, whose actual name is K-A-T, and his relationship with a mouse, Ignatz, who would often hit Cat over the head with a brick. While never a bestseller in syndication, William Randolph Hearst loved it, thus continuing its publication until Harriman's death in 1944. Reportedly, Harriman made $750 a week from the strip, which he felt was more than it was worth, and even offered to reduce his salary to Hearst, but Hearst objected as he loved the comic so much. Despite its modest success, Crazy Cat would be a major influence on many cartoonists and comic artists for decades later, from Will Eisner to Charles Schulz, along with being rated the #1 comic strip of the 20th century by the Comics Journal. Harriman would later make Baron Bean a social class slapstick that ran from January of 1916 to January of 1918. Of note, being a private person, it was revealed decades later that Harriman was in fact of mulatto race, being of Cuban and Native American descent, further cementing his uniqueness in the comic book industry as being one of the few minorities to have such success at the time. The 1920s was the golden age of comic strips, with Cliff Sterrett's Polly and Her Pals about a flapper and her adventures, and Harriman's Crazy Cats being two of the most popular strips. In 1924, Gilbert Solis published the Seven Lively Arts, which celebrated comics like Crazy Cat, Bringing Up Father, and Happy Hooligan. Flappers continued to be popular, with John Held's Merely Margie in 1921, which pushed the modernist style, while Chick Young created Dumb Dora and later Blondie, which would later become the prototype for the family strip. Blondie was originally a flapper, but that strip would later change when decades came on. One pioneering female cartoonist of note was Nell Brinkley, whose Brinkley Girls became a fixture in Hearst's American Weekly Sunday magazine supplement, beginning in 1913. The look of the Brinkley Girls would evolve in the 1920s, becoming more outgoing and adventurous, while still maintaining the glamour and the romance that made them so popular. Barney Google by Bill DeBeck premiered on June 17th of 1919 and even inspired a song in 1923. Originally appearing in the sports page, the series starred Barney Google, a ne'er-do-well involved in various sports from boxing to horse racing. It was in this strip that the horse Sparkplug was introduced in 1922, which later inspired the nickname Sparky for Charles Schulz, the future creator of Peanuts. The Beck evolved the strip throughout its run, even changing Barney Google from a tall and lanky to shorter and stockier, and that character would eventually be written out of his own strip in 1954. To date, Barney Google still runs in syndication, and is the third longest-running strip after the Katzenjammer Kids and Frank O'King's Gasoline Alley, and the second still in syndication after Gasoline Alley. Percy Crosby launched Skippy in 1923 for Life magazine about a young boy living in the city. Crosby was one of the handful of cartoonists to retain his ownership of this strip, and as a result, he took it to Hearst and King Features, who syndicated it in 1926 for a Sunday feature, followed by a daily strip in 1929. The strip soon became so popular it got a Frojo ice cream in 1929 and an Oscar-winning film in 1931 before the strip finally ended in 1945. It was this comic that would be another chief influence for Charles Schultz's Peanuts and Jerry Robinson, the co-creator of Joker and Batman, noted for how it was